How's the whiskey? Do-yoon leaned forward just enough to be heard. Across the table, Lucas lifted his glass and took a slow drink, then set it down without saying anything. Ray noticed it. His hand stayed on his glass, turning it once against the table. Ray's gaze moved once between them, then settled back on Do-yoon. The music pushed louder around them. Someone brushed past the table, voices rising and dropping without staying. This is where nights don't end. Chapter 1. The Pattern. Itaewon was already busy when Ray stepped onto the street. Music spilled out from open doors, mixing with traffic and voices. People moved past each other without stopping, cutting across the sidewalk, or forming short lines outside entrances. Lights from the signs caught briefly on faces and glass, then disappeared as people passed through it. Jiho kept walking. He stayed just far enough ahead to set the direction, lifting a hand once without turning back. Sungil reacted to someone calling his name. Another stepped in close, hand already on his arm. Sungil turned into it, smiling, answering without slowing down. Ray followed a step behind. The entrance didn't stand out. A narrow doorway, a short line, someone familiar at the front. Jiho reached him first. "You're here tonight," he said, already stepping past the rope. The man smiled and lifted it. "Only when you guys show up." Sungil ducked under with a laugh. Ray passed last. The exchange finished before he reached the door. Inside, the music pressed closer. The lighting shifted across the room without settling, catching faces just long enough to register before moving on. Jiho moved through it without hesitation. He touched someone's shoulder, said something quick. People adjusted around him without needing direction. Sungil stopped as soon as there was space. He leaned into the first person who reached him, greeting him with both hands, then pulled on other end briefly before letting him go. His voice carried just enough to be heard, placed where it needed to land. A couple of guys approached Ray. One leaned in to speak. Another rested a hand against the table as he talked. Ray answered without shifting, and the exchange ended as easily as it started. He let his attention move on. A table along the side opened as someone stood. Jiho angled toward it without asking. Sungil followed. Ray took the remaining seat with his back to the wall, the room spreading out in front of him. A server stepped in before they looked up. Jiho ordered without checking the menu. Sungil added something halfway through. The server nodded and moved on. Ray looked across the room. Jiho stood again before the drinks arrived. Someone had already caught his eye. He crossed the space and started speaking before he stopped moving. Sungil watched him go, then leaned back, one arm resting along the back of his chair. "He's not even trying tonight," Ray said. Sungil reached across the table and picked up Ray's glass, taking a drink before realizing it wasn't his. Ray looked toward the group Jiho had joined. People turned toward him without delay. A hand landed on Sungil's shoulders. Sungil turned into it, already smiling, pulling him closer to hear him. The guy laughed before Sungil finished. Sungil let him go and turned back to the table, lifting his glass. "Same people," he said, taking a sip. Ray followed his glance across the room. "It's always the same people." "You guys said that last week," Jiho said. He leaned in long enough to take a sip, his attention already shifting past them. Sungil caught him lightly by the wrist. "Stay for a minute." Jiho didn't pull away, but he didn't settle either. His weight stayed angled toward the room. Ray looked at him. "He's not staying." Jiho smiled. "I am," briefly. A group passed beside them. One of them leaned in without hesitation, resting a hand on Sungil's shoulder as he spoke. Sungil turned, listened, then answered with a low comment that made the guy grin before moving on. Ray watched it happen, then let it go. Jiho had already moved again. He stopped near another group. Sungil leaned back, one arm resting along the back of his chair. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward Jiho. "He doesn't even finish conversations." Ray glanced over. "Well, he doesn't need to." Sungil smiled, but his attention didn't stay there. Sungil turned slightly in his seat, his knee brushing Ray's under the table. You're quiet tonight, he said. Ray looked at him. Am I? Sungil held his gaze for a moment. Closer now. Ray didn't move. The table held for a moment, not empty, just quieter as the people moving in and out shifted elsewhere, pulled toward the center of the room or into other conversations. Sungil turned in his chair, angling toward Ray instead of the room. You're still on that, he said. Ray looked at him. On what? Sungil didn't answer right away, holding his gaze long enough to make the direction clear. Bali. Ray reached for his glass, lifted it, then set it back down without drinking. Sungil watched the movement. There was a trip. Then what? Sungil said. You came back and forgot how to move. Ray looked past him toward the room, then back again. It's not that. Then what is it? Ray rested his hand against the side of his glass. Just this guy I met there. He said it without emphasis. Sungil leaned back, studying him. And who is this guy? Ray didn't answer. Sungil let out a short breath through his nose, something close to a laugh. That's not you, he said. You don't stay on things like that. Ray didn't react. Silence means it's done, Sungil said. And you know that. Ray glanced down at the table, then back up. Yeah. Sungil picked up his glass, took a sip, then set it down again. You'll forget it. Give it a week. Ray didn't argue. Jiho stepped back into the space beside the table, catching the end of it as he pulled a chair in and dropped into it, one arm settling along the back. Are we talking about the Bali boy? He said, looking between them. Ray didn't answer. Sungil leaned back slightly. Jiho held it for a moment, then nodded. All right. He reached for his glass, finished what was left, then set it down again. Then I'll set something up next week. Ray looked at Jiho but didn't speak. There's someone you should meet, he said, not looking directly at Ray. Sungil glanced at him first. Already? Jiho gave a small shrug. Why not? Sungil leaned back, one arm settling along the back of Ray's seat. I met someone too. Jiho didn't look at him. You always do. His name is Do-Yun. He's around. Works nearby. Sungil shifted slightly, his knee brushing Ray's. Ray turned his glass once against the table before speaking. What does he do? Consulting, Jiho said. Something like that. Sungil let out a quiet breath through his nose. That sounds boring. Jiho nudged him lightly, and Sungil caught his wrist without looking, turning it just enough to stop the movement before letting it go. Jiho pulled his hand back. All right. He looked at Ray then, briefly, but Ray didn't answer. I'll bring him next weekend, Jiho said. Group night. Sungil nodded. I'll bring Daniel too. Jiho glanced at him. If he shows up. Sungil gave a small nod, already letting it go. Ray stayed quiet, turning his glass once more before looking at Sungil. Jiho exhaled and stood, not looking at them again. The conversation around the table continued as someone stepped closer to fill the space he left. And Sungil turned to answer without pause, already pulled into something else. Jiho crossed the room without slowing, stopping only when someone stepped into his path. The music pushed louder. More people moved toward the center, pulling others with them. Sungil stood. I'm not sitting all night, he said. He looked at Ray once. Come if you want. Ray nodded but stayed where he was. Sungil didn't wait. Someone caught his hand as he passed, and he let himself be pulled into the crowd, turning briefly to say something that didn't carry over the music. Jiho stood a few steps away, angled into another conversation as the man in front of him leaned in to hear him, one hand resting lightly against Jiho's arm. Jiho said something short, then listened, his attention fixed without shifting. The exchange didn't last long. Jiho adjusted his stance, closing the distance between them, and the other man didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Jiho returned to the table without sitting. The man was with him now, close enough that their shoulders touched. Jiho's hand resting along the back of his neck, not holding him there, just placed. I'm heading out, Jiho said. Sungil glanced up briefly, then back to the person beside him. Already, Jiho gave a small shrug. Yeah, no one asked anything else. Ray looked at the man beside him, and Jiho followed the glance without turning his head. See you, he said. Then he stepped away. The man moved with him without needing to be led. Jiho's hand shifting briefly at his back as they crossed the room, guiding him through the crowd. And by the time they reached the door, they were already in step. Sungil watched them go, then let out a short breath. Consistent. Ray didn't answer. Inside the cafe, the noise stayed low, cups touching the table, chairs shifting, voices carrying without rising. Jiho came straight from work. Do-yoon and Min-jae were already seated. Jiho stepped in without slowing, and Do-yoon looked up first, Min-jae following a moment later. As they exchanged a quick greeting, Jiho took the seat across from them, setting his phone on the table before glancing at their drinks, and then back at them. I'm not staying long, he said. Min-jae lifted his glass slightly, but Jiho didn't respond to it, leaning back just enough to ease out of his shoulders, as his attention settled on Do-yoon. You free this weekend? Yeah, Saturday, Do-yoon said. Jiho nodded once. We're out in Itaewon, group night. I want to introduce you to Ray. Do-yoon held his gaze. That works. Min-jae watched the exchange, then leaned forward slightly. You're setting him up? Jiho didn't answer, and Min-jae leaned back again. Ray just got back from Bali, he said. He travels a lot. Do-yoon nodded, taking it in before looking at Min-jae. Didn't your boyfriend go there? Min-jae looked at him for a second. Then his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen and picked it up as he stood. Yeah, he said. Hold on. He stepped away, answering before he reached the door. Jiho didn't follow him, his attention returning to Do-yoon. Saturday, he said. Then he stood. See you there. Do-yoon gave a small nod. Yeah, see you. Jiho picked up the phone and stepped away from the table. Outside, Min-jae was still on the call. By the weekend, the room filled in early, voices overlapping instead of carrying as the music pushed louder, forcing people closer to hear each other. The table Jiho had used before was already half taken. Jiho crossed the floor first, stopping briefly at the bar before turning toward the table. And Ray followed without needing to look for it. Do-yoon was already there. You made it, Jiho said. Do-yoon nodded. Of course. Jiho didn't sit. Give me a minute. He turned away before either of them answered. The space held enough for Do-yoon to glance at the open spot beside him, then at Ray. You can take this, he said, shifting slightly. Ray stepped in and sat, their shoulders lining up with the edge of the table, close enough that neither needed to adjust. Do-yoon looked around once, then back. You come here often? Enough. Do-yoon nodded once. The conversation stayed simple, work coming up briefly before dropping, a few names passing between them, people they both knew or had seen. Do-yoon asked questions without pressing, and when Ray answered, he listened without looking away. Sungil arrived a few minutes later, pulling Danielle in with him. This is Danielle, Sungil said. Danielle nodded once. Ray returned it. Do-yoon did the same. Someone pulled a chair closer. Another leaned in from the side. The group closed in. The conversation widened without changing tone. Sungil carried most of it, shifting between people and picking up threads before they dropped, while Danielle spoke when addressed, his voice even, his attention steady. Jiho passed through the table once, adding something quick before moving on again. What do you usually do on weekends? Do-yoon asked. Ray looked back at Do-yoon. This? Do-yoon smiled slightly. That makes sense. He didn't ask anything else. Glasses shifted, replaced, moved again. Across the table, Sungil said something that made someone laugh. His hand lifted briefly to brush their arms as he spoke. Ray stayed where he was, and each time the focus narrowed, it returned to Do-yoon. Nothing needed adjusting. Danielle turned slightly when someone approached from behind, waiting until the man stepped fully into the edge of the group before reaching back, his hand landing briefly at his arm. You made it. Lucas nodded once. There wasn't much room left. So Sungil pulled a chair closer with his foot and shifted his leg to make space. Danielle thanked him. This is Lucas, he said. Lucas stepped in and sat. An introduction passed quickly. When his gaze reached Ray, it held for a moment. Ray nodded once. The conversation continued without pause. Sungil picked it back up, turning slightly toward Lucas. You come out here often? Lucas shook his head. No, not really. Sungil gave a small smile. That explains. Lucas didn't ask what he meant. Do-yoon glanced toward him briefly, then looked back at Ray. How's the whiskey? Do-yoon leaned forward just enough to be heard. Across the table, Lucas lifted his glass and took a slow drink, then set it down without saying anything. Ray noticed it. His hand stayed on his glass, turning it once against the table. Ray's gaze moved once between them, then settled back on Do-yoon. Sungil glanced around the table, then pushed his chair back. Now that everyone's here, let's dance. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for Danielle's hand and pulled him up. Danielle stood without hesitation, following as Sungil turned toward the floor, already moving. The space shifted around the table. Do-yoon picked up his glass, then set it back down. I'm stepping out for a smoke, he said. Ray nodded once. Lucas rested his hand near his glass. You don't smoke? He asked. Ray shook his head once. Lucas glanced toward the door, then back. Your boyfriend's going to be lonely out there. Ray looked at him. He's not my boyfriend. Lucas held it for a second, then gave a small nod. Right. He shifted slightly, closing the space between them without making it obvious. Ray didn't move. Their shoulders lined up with the edge of the table, close enough now that neither needed to adjust. Lucas glanced down. Whiskey. Ray followed his gaze to the glass in his hand. Lucas lifted his own. Same. Ray looked at him, just for a moment. Then he picked up his glass up. A small tilt. They clinked. Ray's mouth curved, barely there. Lucas took a sip, then set the glass back down, his attention staying where it was. The door opened. Do-yoon stepped back in, brushing past someone at the entrance before the space closed again behind him. His gaze landed on the table, on them. He didn't pause. Shall we? He said, nodding toward the floor. Ray looked at him, then at Lucas. They moved toward the floor, the crowd opening just enough before closing again. Ray stayed half a step behind before falling into line. The music carried over them as they disappeared into it. Some nights held longer than others. Some conversations stayed, others didn't. Jiho moved through it the same way he moved through everything else, never staying long enough to be part of what remained. Sungil kept the room together whenever it needed it. Ray stayed longer than he expected to, long enough to see what held, long enough to know what didn't. In the end, nothing needed to be decided. The pattern settled on its own. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End, Chapter 1, The Pattern. Stay with us for the next chapter, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more stories on gay audiobooks. I wanted to open up more ways to stay connected with you guys, so there are 2 new corners. First, on YouTube, membership is now open behind the closed door. It's a paid space with early access to stories before they are released. Second, it's on Substack, and it's a no paywall corner. It will be a cozy space for behind-the-scenes content and additional stories. The link is in the description if you'd like to check it out. Thank you.